I've been interested in trying out a Leica vintage lens for a while, but I never actually made the purchase until now. I've been happy with the results I'm getting from the reissue 35mm steel rim and the 28mm Summicron reissue. Here's an example from my 35mm steel rim reissue and the 28mm Summicron. They give off a very different effect than my modern 35mm Summilux FLE or my Q3. But I never actually tried a truly vintage lens, and I was curious what kind of pictures would come out of this. I told myself I wouldn't be buying any more lenses anytime soon, but when I saw the video from Matt Day about his review of the 50mm rigid, he made the point that you can save some money by purchasing a vintage lens in a lower condition. So I bought one of the cheapest ones I could find on KEH, and this was around $300 total. This one is rated in the ugly condition, which is their lowest category, and I can see some signs of age with the darkening or blackening in between the ridges of the knurling, but there's no major dents or scratches, and the glass does not look like it has any major scratches either, and the mechanics of this lens still work perfectly. The aperture ring still clicks well, and the focus ring is also smooth, and that's impressive because this lens is a lot older than me. This lens is very similar to the rigid. They were both made in the 1950s and 1960s, but the dual range has the added capability of performing close distance focus. But for that, you need to mount the goggles on top of the lens. But this did not come with the goggles, and it did not come with any Leica packaging, and not even a lens cap or back cap. So I can't demonstrate the goggles or the close-in focusing, but this lens still does focus from about 1 meter to infinity. I'll go ahead and mount this on the M11. I did hear that this lens works fine on the M11, but not some of the earlier M models. But I couldn't be 100% sure until I actually tried it on and used it. This is a heavy lens coming in at 303 grams, but it's compact at the same time, and it doesn't pull down on the camera, so you can still lay it flat on the table. And I think this silver on black appearance looks really nice. I have the M11 in the black leather Leica half case and the black leather neck strap and the thumb support in the back and a red shutter release button. So it has a nice clean look, just black, red, and silver. I'll be shooting this lens on the M11, but I do have the option of mounting it on the SL2S with an adapter. In comparing it with my reissue lenses, the Summicron is a very tiny lens and it's also lighter, but it also only has a maximum aperture of 5.6. The 35mm steel rim goes up to f1.4, and it's also still lighter and still smaller than the 50mm dual range. And I really do like the kinds of images that come out with the steel rim. I have a, UV protective filter on the steel rim, and I usually shoot most of my lenses without a lens hood. Here's another size comparison between my three silver lenses, and surprisingly, the build quality of the old dual range is just as good or even better than these new lenses. I found no issues with mounting this lens or the mechanics of the aperture ring or the focus ring. So now I have a set of three vintage looking lenses in the 50, 35, and 28. And these complement my modern lenses, the 50mm Summilux and the 35mm Summilux FLE and the 28mm on my Q3. And comparing the dual range with the 50mm Summilux, a totally different look, modern versus vintage, and it also has a totally different character to the photos that come out with these. At the end of the video, I'll do a direct comparison of the photos from the dual range versus the modern 50mm Summilux. Both lenses weigh about the same, but the 50mm Summilux is much longer and bulkier, so I found it easier to shoot with the dual range. These sample photos are all shot on the M11 in aperture priority mode with very minimal editing. This one is in the early morning with frost on the windshield and the sun in the background. And you can see a nice separation of the foreground and also that the colors are very muted and there's a slight haziness overall to the picture. And when I'm shooting older architecture, that really brings out the vintage feeling of this lens. This is on a cloudy day, a shot into the sun. But the common theme here is that most of these images are low contrast and the colors are muted. I even had to bring up some of the contrast and colors in editing. And another vintage looking photo, and I shot this at f11. And in general, I really didn't have problems with the sharpness of this lens. And it really wasn't that difficult to focus with the rangefinder patch, even on f2. And here's a close-up shot trying to show the bokeh effect. Again, I brought up the colors slightly and the contrast slightly, but not too drastically. And in the background, you can see the bokeh of the trees and that slight swirling effect of the trees, especially above the snowman's left hand. And I turned this one into black and white. And again, I really didn't have any problems with sharpness when I view these images in Lightroom. I framed this bus inside a parking structure, and the warm lighting effect also gives this a vintage looking feel. And here are some indoor shots. You can see some of the glowing effects in the light fixture that this lens gives. It's not an extreme effect, but you can see lights glowing or blooming with this lens. And here's another bokeh shot, wide open at f2. I got as close as I could to the Hulk, and he's in pretty good focus, but everything else in the background is blurred out. But you can still shoot at f11 indoors, and things come out pretty sharp. So next I'll do a test shot, switching between the dual range and the Summilux 50mm, just to see what the difference is between a truly vintage lens and a truly modern lens. This will be shot on the M11, trying to keep the same distance with no editing of the photos, and both shot at f2. The first one is shot on the dual range, and if you keep your eye on the center of the tree and the tree lights, you can see the main differences with this lens. Overall, there's a haziness to the photo, a slight white film or fogginess to the photo. And here the Christmas lights don't seem to have much of a blooming effect. And switching to the 50mm Summilux-M, the center of the tree is much darker and clearer and sharper. The white haze is gone, and even with the Christmas lights, the white lights are glowing here even more than the Summicron. Back to the Summicron, and back to the Summilux. Next, I wanted to try this Summilux with a diffusion filter and see if that could replicate the look of a vintage lens. And here's the Summilux with a 1/8 diffusion filter. So you can see that the lights are blooming even more. And there is some slight decrease in the sharpness of this photo, but it still doesn't give that low contrast look or muting of the colors, although you could do that with editing. So summing up this lens, I'll say that the positives are you do get a vintage looking image coming from this lens. It comes at a lower cost because it is so old, but it does have a very durable build quality. And as far as the negatives, these may or may not be negatives depending on what you're looking for. But with that vintage look, you do get low contrast images with muted colors, and you get that washed out look that I was talking about. A slight haziness to the image, a slight fogginess or whitish film that goes over the image. But it doesn't affect the sharpness of the image. I still think this is a pretty sharp lens. And I'm not sure how much of this is just my particular copy. Maybe my lens does need cleaning, and if I send it in for a CLA, maybe the images might come out very differently. So overall, I do like this lens. I like that silver look on the black body, and it's a compact lens and a great durable build quality. And I like the bokeh effect. I think it does give a very different bokeh quality than the 50 millimeter Summilux. And this did come in at a very low cost. So if I end up not liking it, I won't be out that much money. But at this point, I think I still prefer the modern 50 millimeter Summilux. I like the higher contrast of the images and the way the colors come out. And there's still an option of using the diffusion filter on the 50 millimeter Summilux. I'll keep shooting with this dual range 50 millimeter. And my questions going forward is how will this lens perform on the SL2S? And should I send this in for a CLA?